I have no name, no voice, no ambition. I am just a stream, threading through stones and shadows in a forgotten crease of Judea, not strong enough to carry a boat, not wide enough to be marked on a scroll. But I was there, and I listened. That is the one gift I carried across centuries, the silence to listen. When the world above me moved with war and whispers of empires, I flowed. When drought cracked the fields and mothers wept into their shawls, I flowed. When the stars watched in stillness and the prophets stopped speaking, I still flowed. That is how I came to know the prayers no one else remembered, the prayers of women, mothers, widows, girls who came barefoot through dust, whose words barely rose above the reeds. They came not with trumpets, but with quiet, and in that quiet, I learned of longing deeper than words. There was a woman who came before sunrise. Her face was lined by time, her fingers knotted by years of grinding grain and braiding hair. She did not come to draw water, not really. She dipped her hands into my current, then simply sat, her eyes closed, her lips moving without sound. I learned, over time, to read the rhythm of her silence. "Let your promise come," she prayed. "Let the one come who will end our waiting." She never said the name aloud. No one did. But we all knew, Messiah, the Anointed. She said it without breath, without voice, as if speaking it would make the hope too fragile to hold. I never knew if she had children. I only knew that she carried something heavier than grief, expectation, not for herself, but for the world. Others came with arms full, infants pressed to their breasts, toddlers clinging to their robes. They bathed their little ones in my water, sang songs with cracked voices, and told them stories of Abraham and Sarah, of Hannah and Samuel, of Ruth and David, of a future filled with justice. They told these stories not because they believed the world had changed, but because they refused to believe it never would. And in their telling, I felt something stir in me, as if my stream, shallow though it was, had somehow become a mirror to eternity, a place where the ache of the world met the promise of heaven, if only for a breath. I remember a girl, barely 12, who came once and never returned. She didn't speak, she didn't cry. She just sat with her knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the ripples, as if searching for something that might rise from the water. I wanted to hold her, to tell her that hope doesn't shout, it waits. It endures. It flows, even when no one sees. But I had no words, only movement, only the soft language of flowing around stone. When she left a ribbon behind, tied to a branch. It fluttered in the breeze for weeks, until it too was taken by time. And still I flowed. They say heaven listens to prayers, that not a single cry escapes the notice of the eternal. If so, I wonder what became of the countless pleas whispered into my banks. Did they rise like mist to the skies? Did angels gather them like dew? Or were they kept in the folds of God's robe, tenderly pressed against his heart? I do not know, but I carried them anyway. Through dry season and flood, through silence and song, I carried their longing not just for rescue, but for the one who would make all things new. The scrolls speak of Isaiah, of his words thundering down from the mountains. A voice cries out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." But I knew the wilderness long before the voice. I knew it in the cracked lips of mothers who had lost sons to Roman spears, in the hollow eyes of women who bore children to men who never returned, in the tired steps of grandmothers who still lit candles, still believed, still waited. These were the real prophets, women without scrolls, without titles, but with hearts that would not forget the covenant. They waited, not in synagogues or palaces, but by my quiet stream, under fig trees and fading stars. Their faith had no trumpet, no chorus. It was a whisper in the dust. And now, something is changing. I feel it in the soil beneath me. The roots seem more restless, the birds quieter, as if listening. Even the dust, that ever-present veil, seems to lift just slightly at dusk, as if making way for someone. I do not know when he will come. I do not know what form he will take. But I know this: the prayers I have carried are not forgotten. They are folded into the breath of this land. They are soaked into my stream. They wait, and so do I. I am just a stream, but I was there. I listened, and in the quiet, I began to believe what they had long known, that the silence of God is not absence, but preparation. That behind the stillness is a hand, weaving redemption through the long night. That when the voice comes, it will come not in thunder but like water, slipping over stones, unstoppable and sure. Until then, I flow. She never told me her name, not once. And though she came often, more often than any of the others, I only ever knew her by the rhythm of her breath, the shape of her silence, and the way she stepped into my waters like one entering something sacred, not because it was, but because she had chosen to believe it might be. She always came when the shadows began to stretch across the hills, that hour when the sun had already turned its back on the village, but the sky still lingered in color, refusing to say goodbye. She wore a veil, not for modesty, I sensed, but for the quiet protection it offered her face from being read, from being known. And though I am no more than water and earth, I found myself drawn to her constancy, her hiddenness, the weight she carried with such terrible grace. At first, she said nothing at all. She would kneel at the edge of my bank, place her hands in the current, and simply hold them there, unmoving, like she was listening for something in the water, or like she was offering up what she could not put into words. Her hands were rough, but not old, worn from work, but not yet withered by age. There was no jewelry on her fingers, no sign of wealth or belonging, but there was a strength in the way she knelt, deliberate, as though she had made a covenant with the unseen, and she intended to keep it regardless of what answers did or did not come. I watched her for weeks before I ever heard her speak, and when she did, her voice was low, not in volume but in timbre, as if it came from a place deep within her that had been carved out by sorrow and shaped by perseverance. "Lord," she whispered one evening, "if I am never remembered, let him be. If I am never healed, let him be whole. If I am never known, let him be known by you." And I knew then this was not a prayer for herself, but for a child, a son, perhaps, though she never said. She didn't speak of herself, of her needs, of her dreams. Everything was poured into the space she had made for him, whoever he was, whatever future she imagined for him. Her prayer was a vessel empty of self, full of longing, heavy with hope. And though I had heard many pleadings before, something in hers settled deep within me, as if her voice had seeped into my stream, changing the very shape of my flow. She spoke often after that, not in long monologues, but in fragments like broken pottery held together by faith. Let him be kind, not only to those who deserve it. Let him see injustice and not look away. Let him speak truth, even when silence is safer. Let him be ready when the time comes, though I may not be there to tell him it has. I never heard her say his name. Perhaps he had not yet been born. Perhaps he had, and she had given him up. Perhaps he lived with her, and she simply left him sleeping while she came here to pour out what could not be said aloud in the walls of her home. I never knew, and perhaps I was not meant to. But what I did know was this. Hers was not the voice of one demanding a miracle. It was the voice of one who had already given up asking for what she wanted and had begun to pray instead for what the world might need. There was no bargaining in her tone, no sense that God owed her anything. Only a raw and radical surrender, a willingness to disappear if it meant that through her, something better might be born. I had never seen such selflessness wrapped in such solitude. She had no witnesses but the stones, the sky, and me. And we three said nothing in return, but we listened, and in the listening, we were changed. Sometimes she wept, not loudly, the kind of weeping that does not shake the body but empties it slowly, like water seeping through cracked ground. I did not dare ripple too loudly on those days. I let my current slow, soften, as if cradling her grief in liquid arms. Other times, she would sit in stillness long after the light had gone, her figure just a silhouette against the night, unmoving, unafraid. I began to imagine what kind of son would grow from such a mother, what kind of man would rise from such invisible strength. Would he carry her silence into the world? Would he learn to kneel as she had, to see the sacred in the ordinary, to choose love even when it hurt? Would he become the answer to her prayers, not because of what he did, but because of who he dared to be? There was a night, long after the cicadas had stopped singing, when the wind changed. I remember it clearly. The stars were sharp, the air unseasonably cool, and she arrived not with her usual stillness but with an urgency in her steps, like something in her had shifted. She knelt, but not in silence. She cried out not in anger, but in release. "You are not slow to act," she said, "though we call you slow. You are not deaf to pain, though we accuse you of silence. You are not distant, though you wait." She paused, breathing deeply, then added, "I do not understand your timing, but I will not stop waiting." And I, who had flowed through generations of disappointment and longing, felt in her words a kinship, as if the faith she carried mirrored my own quiet endurance. The next evening, she did not come, nor the one after, nor any of the 7 that followed. The place where she usually knelt remained untouched, the soil undisturbed. I kept looking for her shadow, for the flutter of her veil, for the pressure of her knees against my bank. Nothing. The reeds grew a little taller. The stones cooled without the warmth of her hands. The twilight air hung heavier, as if mourning something unseen. I do not know what became of her, whether she moved away, whether she fell ill, whether she simply chose another place to pray, but even in her absence, her presence remained. The water she had touched still shimmered differently. The air still held the echo of her words. And in the deepest part of me, I carried her with me, like a secret I refused to let go. And maybe that is how it is with the holy. It does not always arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes it is a woman with no name who prays not for herself but for a child the world may never notice. Sometimes it is the sound of water remembering a voice. Sometimes it is the invisible sacrifice that shapes history without leaving a trace. I do not know what became of the boy she prayed for. I do not know if he ever heard her voice, or if he grew up never knowing how much was poured into the silence that surrounded him. But I hope that someday he knelt by a stream, somewhere, and heard something in the current that made him pause, that made him remember something he never knew he had forgotten. Because even when the world forgets, water remembers. And though she never gave me her name, I will not forget her, not as long as I flow. The first time I noticed her, she did not walk, she waited. Still as a stone, she stood near the olive grove where my stream narrowed and quieted beneath the bending shade. From where I flowed, I could see her silhouette, outlined by the late sun, her hands clasped together, not in the posture of ritual, but in something far more fragilely uncertain hope. Her face was turned away, her body angled slightly as if torn between staying and retreating, and I wondered if she had been there before, many times even, without me ever noticing. Her veil was a dark one, plain and pulled low, shadowing much of her face. And yet, even from the place where water meets root and stone, I could feel the ache she carried, not loud, not desperate, but dense, settled, as if it had been living inside her for years without room to stretch. She did not cry, not aloud. Her shoulders did not shake, her breath did not tremble, but there was something in the stillness of her posture that spoke of battles fought in silence, of prayers repeated in the hollow of night when no one was listening, of the particular grief that belongs only to women whose arms remain empty after years of longing. I have seen such women before. They come and go, sometimes with husbands, sometimes alone. They look toward the heavens, then look away. They place their hands on their bellies without realizing, and their lips move without sound. And I, who have no voice but carry so many, recognize the weight of barrenness, not only of the womb but of the heart, when life seems delayed, when hope stretches thin. She stepped toward me slowly. The wind pulled gently at the hem of her tunic, revealing dust-caked sandals, legs marked by thorn and journey. She had come far, that much was clear, not just in miles but in seasons, seasons of waiting, of uncertainty, of asking questions that had no answers. When she reached my edge, she knelt, not to drink, but to touch. One hand hovered above the water for a moment before it dipped in, fingers grazing my surface as if testing whether I was real, whether anything still was. I cooled her palm, wrapped her fingertips in the whisper of current, and waited with her. There was a moment, brief and unremarkable to anyone else, when her head bowed just slightly and her hand clenched. She inhaled, not sharply, but with the kind of breath that comes when something inside finally yields not to defeat, but to surrender. And then she whispered, not to me, not even to herself, but to the space between what is and what might be. You gave Sarah a son. You gave Hannah her Samuel. You looked upon Rachel with pity. I am not them, I know. But if you see me, even now, even just this once, do not let this waiting be wasted. It was not accusation. It was not demand. It was the voice of someone who had long since stopped bargaining and simply needed to be heard. Even if the answer was no, even if the answer never came, I wanted to speak, to tell her that I had carried other voices like hers, that the stones beneath her knees had heard the same plea before, in different words, that the water she now touched once cooled the skin of another mother who had walked away pregnant with promise. But I am not wind. I do not carry words. I only reflect them. And so I held her reflection gently, allowed her face to shimmer on my surface-tired eyes, a mouth drawn tight, but a stillness that did not break. She did not stay long, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps less, but time does not move in minutes for women who have waited this long. It moves in cycles, each month a question, each delay a quiet dying. And in that span of presence, I felt the history of Israel swell around her, the stories of women whose names were preserved not for their power but for their patience, whose lives were written in the margins until the margins became the message. She belonged to them, even if no one else would ever write her name, even if her story ended here, beside a nameless stream, on a nameless afternoon. She belonged to them. Before she stood, she dipped both hands fully into me and cupped the water, not to drink, but to pour over her own head. As it flowed down her face, she exhaled slow, long, final. Not final as in the end, but final as in decision. She would leave. And yet something had shifted. She had not received what she came for, but perhaps she had given something, or released something. I watched her go. She did not look back, but the place where she had knelt remained warmer, etched into the earth, a small altar built of invisible sacrifice. That night, the stars came out without sound. The reeds did not sway. Even the frogs, usually so loud, croaked only once or twice. It was a holy silence, not because it was filled with glory, but because it had received someone who bore hope with such care. And I thought then, not for the first time, that the sacred is not found only in fire and thunder, but in the quiet places where unnamed women kneel to pray for children not yet born, for promises not yet seen, for a future still veiled. And if such prayers rise, I believe they rise not only from lips, but from the places that receive them, the stones, the soil, the water, the waiting. I am only a stream, but I have been present when hope wore a veil, when it walked on tired feet and whispered through clenched teeth and knelt with open hands. And though I cannot speak of outcomes, I can tell you this: such prayers are not forgotten. They sink into the earth. They cling to the wind. They flow with me, endlessly, patiently, toward the day when silence will give way to song. She was already old when I first noticed her. Not old like the dry branches that snapped with every breeze, but old in the way the earth is weathered, deep, immovable in places, and softened in others by years of receiving pain without protest. She walked slowly, not because her legs had forgotten how to move quickly, but because she carried a reverence for every step, as if each one was a quiet act of resistance against the years that tried to erase her presence. I do not know when she began coming. Perhaps long before I had learned to listen. Perhaps even before I existed as more than a trickle through the rocks. But she came, and she returned, again and again, not out of habit but out of faithfulness. Faithfulness, not to the outcome, but to the presence itself. She had no companion. No one walked beside her or waited for her. She brought no jar to fill, no bread to eat. She brought only herself and a worn piece of cloth which she spread carefully on a flat stone near my bank, smoothing it with trembling hands before lowering herself slowly to sit upon it. There she would remain, for hours sometimes, her back straight despite the curve of time, her eyes scanning the horizon though there was little to see beyond the hills. She didn't pray aloud. She didn't move much. She simply waited, as if she believed something or someone might come. For the first few visits, I was not certain what she sought. Most people who came to me carried burdens that cried out through every gesture, every sigh, every whispered plea. But she was different. Her waiting was not desperate. It was expectant. She carried no visible sorrow, no urgency, no trembling desire. Instead, she waited like someone who had been told, long ago, that something holy would happen near water, and who had decided to show up every day in case that day was today. I found myself adjusting my flow when she came, softening the noise of my current so that nothing would disturb her stillness. In time, I began to match her rhythm, letting the quiet between ripples stretch longer, echoing the space she created with her presence. Once, after a long silence, she whispered, not to me but to the sky, "You have not forgotten, have you?" It was not a question of doubt. It was a question of companionship, like a friend checking in, not accusing but hoping to be heard. "I have not missed a day," she added, "even the ones when my knees would not bend, even the ones when my sight would not clear." Then she smiled, not the smile of a woman rewarded, but the smile of one who had made peace with not knowing when or how the promise would arrive, only that it would. Her face, framed by wrinkles and wind, bore the peace of those who have waited so long that the waiting itself has become a kind of joy. As seasons turned and the valley changed color, she remained. Birds came and went, children grew into men and left, soldiers passed by with noise and dust, and still she came, folding that same cloth, settling into the same spot. I came to anticipate her presence, as one might anticipate the sun risen not with surprise, but with the steady comfort of knowing that some things remain. In a world where so much shifted, where hope flickered and flared and often faded, she was constant. And in her constancy, I began to understand something I had not before, that waiting, when chosen, becomes a form of worship. That to return, again and again, to a place where nothing has visibly changed, is to declare that presence matters more than proof, that being with the promise is sometimes more important than holding it. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were laced with scripture, not quoted as formula, but breathed as memory. "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise," she murmured once, eyes closed, hands resting on her knees. "As some understand slowness, he is patient." Her voice cracked slightly on that word, as if it carried weight she knew well. "He is not absent, he is coming." She paused then, letting the breeze finish her thought, letting the promise echo between leaf and stone. I held her words in my flow, carried them gently around bends and through roots, hoping they would reach where they needed to go. Years passed. I do not measure them the way you do. I know them only by the trees that grow thicker, the reeds that shift place, the stones that smooth underfoot. But I know that she grew slower. Her hands shook more as she folded the cloth. Her breaths came shallower, yet she never missed a day. And when one morning she did not come, I knew before the sun had fully risen that something had changed. The cloth did not appear. The spot remained untouched, and the silence, once shared and sacred, felt suddenly vacant. I do not know what became of her, whether she died in her sleep or fell ill or was simply unable to make the journey. I do not know if anyone missed her, if anyone remembered her name. But I remembered. I remembered because her waiting had shaped me, because in her stillness I had come to understand something of the eternal, that he, too, waits. Not because he is slow, but because he is present, because he meets us in the spaces where nothing seems to happen, and he fills those spaces with himself. If ever the one she waited for does command, I believe with everything in me that he will. I hope he stops at my bank. I hope he sits where she sat. I hope he touches the stone she once folded her cloth upon. And I hope he sees, in the curve of my water and the silence of my reeds, the echo of a woman who waited not for proof, but for presence, who believed not because she saw, but because she refused to stop showing up, who taught even the stones to hope. And if he does come, I will whisper to him, as best as water can whisper, she was here, every day, without fail, for years, and I believe he will know. I believe he will smile, and I believe he will call her by name, even if no one else ever did. It was a late evening, the kind that seemed to stretch longer than the sun allowed, where the sky blushed in shades of fire before slipping quietly into deep indigo. The wind was gentle that day, warm with the scent of fig leaves and distant cooking fires, and I flowed slowly, not out of fatigue but in reverence, as if I too had sensed something was coming. There had been no visitors for hours. The children had already returned home, The women had finished washing, and the last birds had long since settled into silence. Yet I remained alert, as if the silence itself were watching, waiting, leaning towards something unspoken. And then, through the hush, came footsteps not hurried, not hesitant, but measured, like those of someone who carries words not just in their mouth but in their bone. He was a man of middling age, not old but worn, not young but not yet tired. His robe was plain, his sandals dusty, his face shaded by a cloak that he pushed back when he reached the clearing by my bank. In his hand was a scroll small, tightly wound, bound in leather faded with time. He did not speak at first. He knelt, like so many others had, but not to pray. He listened, not to me, perhaps, but to something deeper. Then, with a sigh that sounded more like remembrance than weariness, he opened the scroll and began to read aloud, not loudly, not for show, but with the voice of someone speaking to the very heart of the earth. "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem." The words were old, older than the man who read them, older than the stream that carried their echo, yet they were alive, as if born again in the cadence of his voice. He did not rush. Each phrase was given space, allowed to settle into the twilight, to mingle with the breeze, to sink into the soil. A voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." At those words, I trembled not from cold, not from fear, but from recognition. I had heard them before, in fragments, in prayers, in lullabies sung by women to children who may never become the ones they dreamed of. But now, spoken aloud by one who carried them like fire in his marrow, they took on weight. They did not merely fill the air. They rooted themselves into the bones of the valley. He continued, weaving the voices of prophets long gone into the night air, Amos with his cry for justice, Micah with his call to walk humbly, Hosea with his relentless love, Isaiah with his vision of a child who would bear our sorrows. The man's voice never wavered. It was not theatrical. It was faithful, as if he did not need to make the words convincing, only present. And in the presence of those words, something ancient stirred not in the rocks or trees, or even in me, but in the very memory of the land itself. Because this was a land that had once lived under promise, had once borne the weight of covenant, and now, though scarred by empires and wearied by exile, it still remembered. The man paused after a while, lowering the scroll into his lap. He did not move to leave. He simply looked out at the hills, now cloaked in shadow, and said softly, "They still wait, don't they?" I was not sure who he meant. The people? The prophets? The promises? Perhaps all of them. "They think he delays," he said again, more to himself now. But delay is not absence. Delay is mercy. Delay is preparation. Then he looked at the sky, now dark and studded with stars. Maybe he waits for us to make room. He fell silent, and I let my waters move gently beside him, as if in agreement. He stayed a little longer, reading more, this time not aloud but in whispers. And I wondered what kind of man chooses to come here, alone, scroll in hand, to read words few listen to anymore. Perhaps a scribe, perhaps a teacher, perhaps just a son of the promise, refusing to let the flame go out. He did not speak of his name, his lineage, or his mission. He simply carried the prophets into the evening, reminding the stones and soil that they had not been forgotten, that their voices still had breath. Before he left, he did something I had not seen anyone do. He took a small stone from the bank, placed it atop the scroll, and held both to his chest. Then he said, in a voice barely audible, "Let it be soon, Lord, not because we deserve it, but because we are breaking." He stood, gathered his things, and left without looking back. The stone remained where he had taken it from, but the words he carried lingered, not just in the air, but in the rhythm of the night. I flowed a little slower after he left, as if I needed time to absorb what I had heard. And I realized then that the prophets do not only speak to the people, they speak to the land, to the waters, to the winds, to the places that hold memory. Because it is not just human hearts that grow weary of waiting. The earth, too, groans for redemption. The rivers long to see justice roll down like themselves. The valleys strain for the sound of footsteps that will finally bring peace. And if the prophets still echo in our evenings, perhaps it is because the promise still holds, carried not just in scrolls and sermons, but in the quiet persistence of those who keep reading, keep hoping, keep showing up when the world has gone silent. That night, as the stars watched in silence and the wind fell still, I whispered the prophet's words back to the sky, not in speech, but in flow, because even if the people forget, the water remembers. And Ismail, unseen, unremarkable, will keep carrying their voices until the one they foretold walks the earth, and silence becomes song once more. It was the quietest morning I had known in years. The kind of quiet that does not come from the absence of noise, but from the presence of something so tender, so delicate, that even the birds seemed to hush their songs in reverence. The sky had not yet warmed. A soft mist hovered low over the valley, clinging to the olive branches and bending gently over my water, as if the dawn itself was unsure of how to arrive. I moved slowly, cradling the reflections of a world not quite awake, and that was when I saw a man, a woman, and something swaddled between them, carried not with show or flourish, but with a kind of careful awe that wrapped around them like an invisible light. They didn't speak much. The man walked ahead, pausing often to glance back, checking not only the path but her face. She followed, clutching the bundle to her chest, not tightly, but securely, as one would hold something newly given and not yet fully understood. Her eyes were dark with fatigue, not from sleep lost to indulgence, but from the kind that comes when a body gives more than it has, when a soul bears the mystery of life and trembles under the weight of what it might mean. The child made no sound. I expected cries, the gurgling discomfort of newborn breath meeting morning chill, but there was only stillness, as if the very air conspired to keep the peace intact. When they reached my edge, the man knelt first, cupping water to wash his face. The woman remained standing, swaying gently, as if to keep the rhythm of the child's heartbeat intact. Then, without ceremony, she lowered herself to the stone near the bend, where my current turned slow and clear. There, she looked down at the child. I could not see his face, only the edge of a blanket, a hand no larger than a fig leaf, fingers curled inward, in the universal gesture of beginnings. She said nothing for a long time. Then she lifted her eyes to the sky, not in question, not in protest, but with the look of one trying to memorize everything: the color of the morning, the hush of the world, the feel of water nearby. "This world is not ready for him," she said quietly, her voice barely above the rustle of the reeds. "And neither am I." The man looked over, but did not speak. He simply sat beside her, and together they watched my water, watched the mist rise, watched the day break. "They will not believe," she said again. "They will look at him and see only a child. They will not know what waits inside him." She paused, her gaze fixed on a single point beyond the horizon. "But I do. Even if I don't understand it, I do." She touched her fingers to the child's brow, and in that gesture, I felt the trembling courage of a mother handing her heart to the future. She bathed him then, not in ritual, not in a way passed down by law, but with a reverence born of wonder. Her hands moved slowly, dipping into my current, lifting water to his skin, as if each drop were a prayer, a promise, a shield. The child did not flinch. He did not cry. He simply received, and I, who had seen so many bodies lowered into my stream, some hopeful, some weary, some desperate, I had never known a moment so quiet, so full, so unbearably gentle. The water that touched him did not ripple, it calmed. The stones beneath him seemed to still their hum, and I understood then, without words, that this was not just another birth. This was a beginning that reached backward as well as forward, a circle of something eternal finding its way into flesh. When she finished, she lifted him against her, holding him not as a possession, but as one entrusted with mystery. She did not speak again. Neither did the man. They remained a while longer, watching the sky lighten, the mist lift, the world resume its motion. A shepherd's call echoed from the ridge. A bird took flight, and slowly, as if reluctant to re-enter the rhythm of ordinary life, they stood. The man offered his hand, She took it. Together, they walked away, leaving behind only footprints in the soft earth and the lingering imprint of something sacred. After they left, I flowed differently. Not faster, not louder, but with a kind of intention I had not known before, as if I now carried something more than water, as if I, too, had been baptized. The place where he had touched me did not glow, did not shimmer, but it stayed with me. As the sun rose and villagers came to draw water and children laughed and donkeys brayed and life resumed, I held a silence beneath my surface that no one could hear, but that changed the way I moved. I had seen the cradle before it had been carved. I had received the hope before it had spoken. I had known the one before the world had named him. And I wondered, not for the last time, if this was how the holy enters the world, not with trumpets and fire, but with quiet steps and tired hands, with mothers who whisper into dawn, and fathers who watch in silence, with water that flows unnoticed, and cradles what it does not comprehend. Perhaps divinity does not demand to be seen, perhaps it only asks to be received. So I flow, not to carry away, but to remember, because even when voices forget, water does not. I remember the child who did not cry, the mother who did not waver, the silence that was not empty. And in remembering, I prepare the way not with greatness, but with gentleness, not with power, but with stillness. Because sometimes the cradle is quiet, and sometimes the quiet is enough. It was not a day that announced itself with thunder. There was no trumpet in the clouds, no earthquake in the ground. The sky was clear, deceptively ordinary, with the kind of sunlight that slips lazily over hills and makes olive leaves flicker like tiny flames. Birds sang as they always did, goats wandered near the rocks, and I flowed as I had always flowed, steadily, quietly, unnoticed. And yet, beneath all that familiarity, there was something else, a stillness, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness that comes just before something shifts. A pause, as if the sky had inhaled but forgotten to exhale, as if creation itself had reached the edge of something it could not yet name. He came with others, not alone. There were men beside him, men behind him, and voices in the air, but he stood apart, not in distance, but in presence. I had seen many men come to the river in those days. Some came to preach, some to confess, some to cleanse, but none carried what he carried, not in his hands, not in his posture, but in the silence that seemed to follow him like a second shadow. I had heard his name whispered in the mouths of shepherds, muttered by widows, hoped for by mothers, but it was not until I saw him that I understood why they spoke of him without truly speaking. He did not rush, he did not delay. When he stepped into the water, the men who stood nearby grew quiet, as if instinctively sensing that this moment did not belong to them. The prophet stood waiting, John, the one with eyes like burning coals, who had shouted into the wilderness until the rocks themselves remembered how to hope. But even John seemed smaller in that moment. He looked at him not with superiority, but with awe, like someone finally seeing the answer to a question they had carried all their life, but never dared to ask aloud. They spoke few words, enough to break the surface of silence, not enough to disturb it. "I need to be baptized by you," John said. "And do you come to me?" A pause. Then the reply, quiet but firm. "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." And with that, the impossible happened. The one who had nothing to repent of was lowered into the waters that had received 1,000 confessions, 1,000 sins, 1,000 stories of regret and beginning again. And I, who had carried every one of them, felt the weight of it shift, not because he added to it, but because somehow, by entering, he had begun to transform it. The water around him changed, not in color, not in temperature, but in memory. It remembered Eden. It remembered the voice that hovered over the deep. It remembered the flood and the dove and the parting sea. It remembered every time it had been used as a threshold between what was and what could be. And now, as he rose from the water, dripping and radiant in his ordinariness, something opened. Not just the sky, but time itself. Light split the air, not like lightning, but like truth, gentle and sure. And the voice came, not as a shout, not as a proclamation from afar, but as a father leaning in close to whisper to his son, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." The others heard it too, though they would later question whether it was thunder or imagination. But I knew because water recognizes its maker. And the water in me, every drop that had traveled through root and cloud and stone to be here, bowed. Not visibly, not in some grand display, but in essence. My current stilled, not because I willed it, but because even the flow must yield to the presence of the holy. The dove descended then, not fluttering, but gliding, as if it too remembered the first time it had been sent out in search of new life. And now, having found it, it returned not to a branch, but to the shoulder of the one who would carry the weight of the world. The sky, for a moment, held its breath. The birds stopped, the wind ceased, and I understood, as deeply as a stream can, that nothing would ever be the same. Not for the men who stood there, not for the earth beneath them, not for me, because this baptism was not about cleansing sin, it was about claiming identity, not about washing away, but about stepping into. And from that moment, every time I heard a man or woman whisper a prayer into my banks, I carried it differently, not just as a longing, but as a promise, not just as a question, but as something already answered. He left shortly after, without fanfare, slipping into the wilderness like a shadow at dusk. But he left behind more than footprints. He left the memory of heaven breaking open, not in wrath, but in tenderness. He left the echo of a father's voice affirming not just him, but everyone who would one day follow. He left the water changed, not in form, but in meaning. And I, who had once been merely a vessel for human burden, became, in that moment, a witness to divine revelation. Since that day, I have never flowed the same. The stones beneath me seem warmer. The reeds bend differently. And when mothers come to wash their children, when men come to whisper their regrets, when strangers dip their hands into my stream unsure of why they feel drawn, I know it is not me they seek. It is the memory. It is the presence. It is the promise that once, when the sky held its breath, love stepped into the water and made it holy. There are silences that comfort, like the hush between mother and child as breath syncs with heartbeat. There are silences that speak, heavy with the weight of what cannot be said but is somehow understood. And then there is the silence that followed him, not the quiet of solitude, nor the stillness of peace. This silence was different. It lingered in the spaces where miracles had passed, where crowds had cheered and then disappeared. It settled like dust after movement, like a held breath that never found its release. And I, who had once rippled with the memory of his baptism, who had carried the echo of the Father's voice and the brush of the Spirit's wings, now found myself surrounded by quiet so deep it felt like morning. He had gone, not forever, but for now, into the wilderness, they said, into the places where only wind and stone reside. I did not know what he sought there, or what sought him, only that the current which once carried the divine had been asked to wait. I do not wait well, water is made to move. But in his absence, even I slowed. My flow became a whisper, my banks grew still, the reeds leaned inward, as if huddling for comfort, and the birds who once sang to greet him now fluttered without song. Time stretched thin, not days, not nights, just the slow unraveling of expectation, the ache of those who had tasted something holy and now hungered for it again. The people still came, but they came differently. Their feet were heavier, their prayers were quieter. They did not look at me, not really. Their eyes searched beyond the hills, toward the dry places, the hidden ravines. Some spoke his name with hesitation, as if unsure if they had dreamed him. Others said nothing at all, only knelt and let their hands sink into the water, as if hoping touch could recall memory. And I, poor stream that I am, could only receive, could only cradle their questions, their fading hope, their silent pleas. There was a woman who came often in those days, young, with eyes that seemed older than they should have been. She never stayed long, just long enough to trace a shape in the mud with her finger, a fish, a flame, a letterand, then wash it away before anyone could see. Once, I heard her say, "If he comes back, I will follow." She did not look like someone meant for following. She had the hands of one accustomed to work, to being unseen, but her voice carried something fragile and fierce, the kind of hope that survives fire. Others came to men who once shouted, "Hosanna," now silent, children who had tried to touch his robe, now clutching their mother's hands, a blind man who once begged beside the road, now sitting by my bank, waiting for footsteps that never arrived. And still, the silence held, not hostile, just long, too long, the kind of silence that makes you question the sound you once believed in. I tried to remember the way his feet had moved through my current, the way the light had caught the drops on his skin, the way the air had shifted when the heavens opened. I remembered with everything I had. But even memory fades when not fed, and I feared they would forget, that the people would stop coming, that the silence would swallow the story before it had a chance to grow. But then something unexpected happened. In the stillness, they began to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way roots grow, underground slow, invisible, certain. They started telling stories, to each other, about him, about the way he spoke, about how he touched the leper without flinching, how he wept when his friend died, how he stood in the synagogue and read from Isaiah and sat down without apology. They told these stories not with certainty, but with reverence, as if each telling helped them remember a little more clearly, as if speaking his name out loud might call him back. Children acted out his parables. Women whispered his promises while grinding grain. Old men stared into the fire and mouthed his words like a psalm. And slowly, the silence became something else, not absence, not abandonment, but space. Space where stories could breathe, where hope could stretch, where waiting could become holy. And I realized then, in the depths of my being, that silence is not the enemy of faith. Silence is its soil, the place where the seed is buried, the dark from which light is born, the womb from which resurrection rises. I had feared the silence meant he was gone, but now I began to wonder if silence was his invitation, his way of saying, "Watch, listen, remember." I kept flowing, gently, faithfully, not with the urgency of before, but with the patience of water that knows it will meet him again. That knows the one who stepped into me once will return, not just in body but in every act of love, in every story told around a fire, in every broken heart that dares to believe healing is still possible. And when that day comes, when he returns, when the silence breaks, I will be ready. I will rise to meet him, not with thunder, but with memory. With the song I've carried through the longest silence, a song not made of notes, but of all the voices who waited beside me, who whispered into the quiet, who believed without seeing. A song of hope that flows even when the sky does not speak. A song that says, "You are not forgotten. We are still here. We still believe." It was not the wind that warned us, nor the sky, though both shifted in subtle ways. The wind grew restless, not in strength, but in direction, swirling against its own rhythm, as if unsure whether to flee or remain. The sky, too, seemed unsure of itself, clouds gathering without purpose, light dimming not with time, but with hesitation. Yet it was not these that told us what was coming. It was the stones, the ones who never move, never speak, never tremble. They remembered. I have flowed over them for generations, these stones, smoothed them, carried their stories, wrapped them in moss and mist. I thought I knew them, but on that day they were different. They did not glisten, they did not hum. They waited, still as death, as if holding something back. And I, who have always moved freely, felt the resistance in their silence. It was as if they had once known him, known his steps, his voice, the weight of his presence, and now, sensing the nearing of his sorrow, they mourned in stillness. Word reached the valley slowly, scattered like seeds on dry ground. Some said he had been taken, others said he had surrendered. Most did not understand what it meant. A prophet condemned, a teacher betrayed, a healer silenced, but the stones knew. Before the soldiers marched, before the crosses were raised, before the women wept, the stones knew, and they grieved. I remember the moment I felt the earth groan. It was not thunder, it was deeper than that, more intimate, a sound not heard with ears but felt in the bones, as if creation itself exhaled in pain. And then, suddenly, violently, the ground split. Not here in the valley, but far beyond, on a hill soaked in blood and silence. I did not see it, but I felt it, like a tremor in my own current, a tearing, a breaking, a cry that rose not from mouths, but from matter. And I knew then, he had died. I had not seen the nails, I had not heard the mocking, but I felt the stones beneath me shudder, and that was enough. They had held his weight once, as he walked the roads of Galilee. They had rested beneath his feet, as he knelt to pray. And now, as his body collapsed against the wood, they remembered every step, every word, every silence, and they broke. For hours, nothing moved. Not me, not the birds, not even the wind. Time lost its grip, stretched thin and brittle like parchment in fire. People came to the water's edge, but did not speak. They knelt. They touched the surface. They wept without knowing why. Perhaps they had not known him personally. Perhaps they had never heard him teach. But the stones remembered, and through them, the grief passed into everything, into soil, into sky, into me. 3 days passed, or so they say. For me, it was longer. An eternity compressed into stillness. I flowed again, but sluggishly, as if carrying sorrow in every drop. The stones, too, were heavy, no longer yielding beneath my current. They bore weight I could not wash away. Until the morning they warmed. It was not sudden, no blaze of glory, just a slow return of something lost. The birds sang again, uncertain at first, as if testing the air. The wind shifted toward the east, and the stones beneath me began to hum, quietly, faintly. But I knew something had happened, something impossible, something remembered. I would not learn the full truth until later, when women came running down the path, breathless, eyes wide not with fear but with astonishment. "He is risen," one whispered, kneeling at my bank, splashing water on her face as if to confirm she was awake. "The tomb is empty." And the stone, yes, the one that sealed his grave, they said it had been rolled away. Not by hands, not by men, but by something greater. And I wept, not from sadness, but from awe, because the same stones that had trembled at his death now sang beneath my flow. The same ground that had cracked with sorrow now pulsed with hope. And I, who had carried the memory of his baptism, now carried the echo of his return. Not just his presence, but his promise that death does not win, that silence is not the end, that what is buried can rise. Since that day, the stones have never been the same. When feet touch them, they respond, not loudly, not visibly, but in the way they give, the way they hold, the way they whisper to those who walk upon them. He walked here, he lives. And I flow over them with reverence, knowing that I do not carry mere sediment, but testimony, that every pebble, every shard, every hidden rock bears witness. The world moved on, as it always does. Empires rose, wars came, seasons turned, but the stones never forgot, and neither did I. For in the stillness of that death, and in the trembling of that morning, we became something more than earth and water. We became memory. We became altar. We became the quiet, unshakable voice that says, even when all else fades, he was here, he lives, and nothing will ever be the same. I remain. Long after the sandals have turned to dust, long after the voices have faded into history, long after even the stones have grown smooth from the weight of time, I remain. I do not boast of it. I do not grieve it. I simply flow, not because I must, but because I was made to, because there is something in me that remembers, and remembrance is not a task that ends. It is a current, endless, quiet, persistent, and I have chosen to remain, not as a relic of what was, but as a witness to what will be. The hills around me are not as they once were. There are more roads now, carved with iron and fire. There are more walls, more voices, more questions. And yet, people still come. Some stumble upon me, unaware. Some seek me out, as if drawn by something they cannot name. A few know, most do not. But I recognize them, the seekers, the mourners, the wanderers who carry something fragile in their silence. They touch my water, they pause, some kneel, a few weep, and every now and then, one speaks his name, not loudly, not as doctrine, but as longing. I never tell them the stories. I do not unfold the days of his life, the fire in his words, the stillness of his gaze. That is not my role. I am not preacher. I am not prophet. I am the stream that waits. I wait because he promised. Because before he left, he said he would return. And I, who watched the sky split open at his baptism and the earth break beneath his death, believe him. Not because I understand all things, but because I remember the way his feet entered my water without hesitation, the way his presence stilled even the reeds, the way the wind held its breath as the Father called him beloved. So I wait, not with desperation, but with faith, the kind that does not ask for signs but listens for footsteps, the kind that does not measure time in hours or years, but in echoes and silence. And as I wait, I keep flowing not to forget, but to remember. I carry the stories in my current, not as history, but as seed. I pass them from bend to bend, whispering them to the roots, to the stones, to the air that touches the faces of those who come. They do not always hear me, but sometimes they pause longer than expected. Sometimes they close their eyes. Sometimes they smile without knowing why. Children play here still. Their laughter rises into the olive trees like incense. They do not know what happened beneath these branches, beside these stones. But I do, and I bless their joy, because joy, too, is memory. Joy, too, is waiting. And when they run through the shallows, splashing as if to wake the world, I ripple with them not to disturb the past, but to keep it alive. Old men come with tired eyes and cracked hands. They sit beside me, not to wash, but to listen. Not to me, perhaps, but to the quiet, to the pull of something deep. They speak little, but they sigh. And sometimes they say his name, softly, like a prayer half remembered. And I remember for them. Once, a woman came and said, I never saw him, but sometimes I feel him, here. And she touched the surface of my water as if it were skin. She wept, not from sadness, but from recognition. And I held her tears with reverence, letting them join the memory I carry, letting them become part of the waiting. I do not know the hour of his return. I do not know what it will look like. I do not know if he will come in fire or cloud, in trumpet or whisper. But I know this, when he does, I will be here. I will rise to meet him, as I did once before, and I will carry his reflection as far as the sea will let me. I will not speak, I will not shout, but I will sing not in words, but in flow, in ripple, in the quiet exhale of water, remembering what it was made for. Until then, I wait, not out of duty, but out of love, the kind of love that does not demand return, but trusts it. The kind of love that holds memory not as burden, but as treasure. I wait with the stones, with the soil, with the trees that lean over me like elders remembering the voice of the wind. I wait with the birds who return each season, with the stars who watched his birth. I wait with the silence, and in that waiting, I remain full, because he was here, because he is not done, because even in the stillness, even in the long night, the water remembers. I wait still.